All right, here's your quick and dirty overview of the military side of the Civil War. Now, this is intended to give a swift look at the key military turning points, the big battles that you'll need to know for the AP exam. But while you're looking at this, it's crucial to keep in mind that the other videos about the ideological, social, political, economic impacts of the Civil War were integral to the military side of the war. Nothing here exists in separation. We just have to treat it that way for the purposes of review. And as we're starting out with a quote, the way we always do, "You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end." That's what William Tecumseh Sherman said back in 1861 when he began to get word that states were seceding and that Lincoln was likely to have to call for volunteers. And it's worth keeping in mind that at the beginning of this war, and throughout all the battles that we'll be looking at, people don't know how it will end. These battles are meaningful. Even after Gettysburg, no one was sure that the outcome would end in a certain way. And so each battle has to be looked at individually in terms of its importance to the thinking and the formation of the next battle, not as some final turning point where the fate of one side or the other was sealed. All right, so let's go. The first really crucial battle for you to understand is the Battle of First Bull Run. This battle was not really a military turning point in the sense that either side lost a significant number of troops or a significant position, but it did have an important function because it was the first time the two armies met, fully prepared for battle, and used their new weapons, tactics, and motivation against one another. Much of the civilian population and many of the soldiers on both sides went into Bull Run expecting an easy battle, expecting one side or the other to break and run and simply to end the war right then and there on the fields of northern Virginia. When the two sides did end up meeting, just south of Washington, D.C., the battle lasted a full day. It went back and forth across the field, first with Confederate troops retreating, then rallying around General Jackson, who got his name Stonewall Jackson there at the battle, and then with Union troops retreating. In fact, retreating so fast that their lines overran many of the civilian observers who had come to watch the battle. In fact, several congressmen were taken prisoner and spent the rest of the war in Confederate jails because they had come out to watch what they thought would be a beautiful set piece of a battle. So that's First Bull Run. Northern Virginia, the first meeting between the two armies, and a very swift shattering of anyone's illusions this would be a quick and easy war. With that realization in mind, both armies retreated north until 1862, with the Union concentrating on putting a naval blockade around the South, which we'll discuss more in the political and economic developments in the war. The next major land battle were the 7 Days Battles. By the time of the 7 Days Battles, the commander who had lost Bull Run for the Union had been replaced by a young and ambitious guy named General McClellan. And again, more on him in the political side of the war because he had tremendous political ambitions of his own. Anyway, McClellan trained up the army for the better part of 7 months before finally deciding to take an alternate route and taking the army down the coast of Virginia to the edge of the Chesapeake Bay, landing at Fort Monroe and pushing up the peninsula, trying to take Richmond in a less heavily defended direction than from the north, where there were a tremendous number of Confederate armies waiting, going through Fredericksburg all the way down to Richmond. However, this long campaign did not end very well for him. He moved too slowly up the peninsula until finally, when he reached Richmond in a series of battles, which were called the 7 Days Battles, he was badly defeated over and over again, draining his army and draining the Confederate army as well. During these battles, the Confederate army received its new commander when its current commander was killed during a battle outside of Mechanicsville. The new commander will be named Robert E. Lee. At the end of the 7 Days Battles, McClellan had to retreat all the way back down the peninsula, which was actually in Union hands for the rest of the war, and return to Washington, D.C. to get fresh troops and train up for the next year's campaigns, leaving Virginia more or less completely at a standstill. Ultimately, the importance of the 7 Days Battle was in setting up the two generals with their armies, Lee and McClellan, for the next year of the war, and in showing that there was no easy and productive path through Virginia for McClellan, and no easy and productive path straight into Washington for Lee. This sets us up for the next campaigns in the East. But in the meantime, we want to move to the West. The Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Tennessee River, where we're going to meet a couple of new generals and find one of the first other key battles of the war in that region. The war in the West was really a river war, especially in these first few phases. You can see here on the map, you've got the Mississippi River, the Ohio, and all these other major waterways, which were the most important way to move supplies, soldiers, and information even during this phase of the campaign. So the Union had a decisive advantage in that they had a very strong fleet of gunboats that would go up and down the rivers and help to siege or soften Confederate positions before the Union Army attacked. This required some pretty innovative tactics, which were used on the Union side by a guy named Ulysses S. Grant, who was the primary general for the Union in this phase of the war. Now, after taking two major forts at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, which you can see there are sort of on the left side of the map, and defeating a small Confederate force at New Madrid, the Western theater sort of came to a focus on the small town of Shiloh, which was right near a major fork where two rivers would go off from one another and proceed farther south. At Shiloh, basically Grant's own force failed him, or he failed them, whichever one you want to decide on. They were caught with their pants down on the first day of the battle. It was a 2-day battle. And they were ambushed by the Confederate commander, Johnston, and pushed back across the field almost all the way to the river. And then this new technology of the steamboat allowed reinforcements to come up very quickly in the late evening, night, and early morning. So that the second day they could push back across the same ground that they had been pushed forwards across the first day. This meant that the Battle of Shiloh ended up having a huge number of casualties. For example, although the 7 Days campaigns had a large number of casualties when you put them all together, each individual battle hadn't been that much worse than the Battle of First Bull Run, which resulted in about 4,000 or 5,000 people killed or wounded. The Battle of Shiloh, by comparison, had well over 20,000 people killed or wounded in one single day of fighting, about 20,100 people all told. This was the first battle of the Civil War to really show the degree to which the new weaponry and old tactics would be combining to cause mass casualties that were unprecedented in the history of American warfare. It was also deeply important because even though the first day was a terrible defeat for Ulysses Grant and the Northern forces, the second day and the aftermath basically pushed the South out of control of the northern part of the Mississippi River area and of all the subsidiary rivers that sort of honeycomb the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Missouri. It would be a decisive advantage later in the western phase of the war, as we'll see. At roughly the same time as the Battle of Shiloh is going on in the West, we're going to shift ourselves back east to look at the next key battle you should know about, the Battle of Antietam. This is also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, so don't get confused if the two sides, Confederate and Union, use different names, and occasionally the two names are used interchangeably in historical texts or in questions. So it's the Battle of Antietam, also sometimes called the Battle of Sharpsburg. Now, McClellan and Lee are still in command here, and they have very different styles. McClellan is a careful, defensive fighter. Lee is an aggressive person who wants to get north, win a major victory, maybe even convince some European powers to intervene. So that's the strategy that's going on. In order to do this, Lee pushes into Northern Virginia and actually defeats Union forces in Northern Virginia in a couple of key battles. He decides to use that momentum to continue going north. And this time he's going to aim for the state of Maryland, trying to go around the defenses of Washington, D.C. Now it takes a little while, but McClellan gets his troops together and follows him into Maryland, going west out of D.C. until they meet sort of in the part of Maryland right near where it meets what is today West Virginia. This is where the town of Sharpsburg is. The two forces maneuvered around one another for a couple of days until they finally met near Antietam Creek. The battle was a one-day general engagement, which is the name that Civil War tacticians gave to the type of battle where both sides' armies met at the same time on the same field without one army having a hugely significant advantage by defending or attacking a prepared position. The resulting battle, which raged back and forth across river bridges and through sunken roads which were used as redoubts, cost more than 26,000 casualties, of which almost 6,000 were dead rather than wounded. This was much more death and destruction in any one battle that had occurred before, even at Shiloh, and more importantly, it happened right next to the major cities of the East Coast, where the new photographic reporters of the era, like Matthew Brady, could come in and get a good look at it. Antietam really brought the war home to the North in a very significant way. Although both sides lost a tremendous number of troops, in many ways Antietam is remembered as a Northern victory, if only because it stopped any further movements northward by Lee's army. In addition, it gave Lincoln a lot of reasons to eventually issue the Emancipation Proclamation in the wake of the battle. He would need more men if these type of battles continued, and it also gave this huge loss of life kind of a moral purpose, but we'll talk more about that in the political and ideological and social sections of this lecture. Finally, it's worth noting that after the battle, McClellan refused to pursue the forces of Lee as they retreated southwards across the Potomac back into northern Virginia. This really put Lee and McClellan on different grounds and put Lincoln and McClellan on terrible terms, and soon McClellan would be replaced in the wake of the Antietam campaign. This is going to set us up to turn our sights back east, with the war in the West sort of stopped for the moment. The River War in the West under Grant's command continued throughout 1862 and into 1863. By early 1863, he had pushed all the way down the Mississippi River towards the northern part of Louisiana, where a very important fortress city called Vicksburg guarded one of the main checkpoints along the river, which many ships had to pass to go north or south, and which meant that even the Union's capture of New Orleans in 1862 wasn't completely crippling Mississippi River trade and movement for the Confederacy. For several months, Grant held Vicksburg under siege. In the meantime, the armies of the General Rosecrans and Burnside, under other commanders subsidiary to Grant, in the nearer part of the West to Virginia, pushed south, crippling Confederate defenses around Nashville and Chickamauga. Finally, when Vicksburg fell, this meant that not only was the Confederacy now cut in half, all of Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas were cut off from the heartland of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, but after the Battle of Chattanooga and Chickamauga, there was an open way into the heartland of the Confederacy. Vicksburg not only made Grant's name as a commander, but it was also in many ways the turning point of the Western War. It meant that there was no longer a cotton trade on the Mississippi River. It meant that many of the fundamental functions of the Confederate government were no longer operable. And it meant that a huge part of the Confederate Army was now going to have to fight with fewer supplies. It's hard to underestimate the importance of the fall of Vicksburg in July of 1863. If it wasn't for another thing that had happened the same July of 1863, you might call Vicksburg the most important battle. But that slightly suspect honor goes to the single most costly, most famous, and certainly most significant battle of the entire war, the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It happened in July of 1863 at the exact same time as the fortress of Vicksburg on the Mississippi was under siege. Robert E. Lee had decided to resume his northern campaign, reasoning, along with Jefferson Davis, that the single best hope that they had of winning the war was in forcing the North to decide that it was far too costly, or convincing European powers that the Confederacy stood a real chance, and that the best way to do that was to penetrate the basically unharmed centers of northern farm production and civilian population, maybe even pick up a few converts to the Confederate cause along the way. So Lee took his army and again went around the defenses of Washington, D.C., but this time they went even farther around, going up the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania, the whole time shadowed on the other side of the mountains by a Union army. Eventually, the two armies sought each other out, and after days of tentatively sending out cavalry expeditions to try and figure out where the other army was, they both came together and met in the small and pretty much previously unimportant town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. The specific military actions during the 3 days at Gettysburg are probably one of the most studied series of military decisions in American history. There's only really two that are useful or important to know, at least at our level. One of these is the defense of Little Round Top. On the second day, it was entirely likely that the Confederate forces were going to be able to come around the side of the Union forces by going over a hill called Little Round Top and seizing it, putting artillery up there. A single division from the Northern Army, led by a guy from Maine named Joshua Chamberlain, himself organized the defense of and just barely held on to it, ensuring that the North would at least keep things stalemated during that second day. On the third day, there was an event that's called Pickett's Charge, which is incidentally something that we still use today in our language as a sort of way to refer to something that's a lost cause or a foolish attempt at doing something that's impossible. In one last-minute ditch attempt to break the Union lines, General Lee ordered one of his commanders to make a mass charge supported by a heavily artillery barrage straight into Union lines, which was really, given the military technology that we're going to talk about in some of the other lectures, a terrible idea. And the losses among the units that made the charge were upwards of 70 and 80% of the men who made the charge. Now, with those two engagements a little bit in mind, giving you some of the flavor of the battle, you have to keep in mind the sheer number of casualties overall. If Shiloh had been considered bad with 20,000 killed and wounded, and Antietam had been considered awful with 26,000 killed and wounded, over the course of the 3 days at Gettysburg, more than 50,000 troops were killed and wounded. It was really beyond most people's imagination at the time, and it truly exhausted the resources of the South and shocked the sensibilities of the North. Ultimately, Gettysburg was a Union victory, much like Antietam, because the South had to stop moving north, and because the North had a series of victories it could claim to up morale. Now, though Gettysburg was important, in many ways it wasn't really decisive. And Lincoln and many of the Northern commanders felt like they had to pursue Lee's army further south and really put some pressure on the Confederate capital at Richmond in order to make steps towards winning the war and hopefully winning before Lincoln had to face re-election. And so in 1864, he took Ulysses S. Grant, fresh from his victory at Vicksburg and cutting the Confederacy in half, and took him east to the Virginia theater and gave him command of all the Union armies there in Virginia. Grant decided that because he had more men, more supplies, and a better movement advantage than Lee did, it was his turn to take the offense, move south from Washington into northern Virginia, down through Fredericksburg and on to Richmond. This was a very long campaign. It took most of 1864, and it was very relentless. Every single battle in this campaign had as many casualties as the terrible earlier battles had, Shiloh and Antietam, except they happened one after the other. They weren't exceptions. Grant was nicknamed the Butcher during these campaigns for relentlessly pushing the Union Army through battle after battle against Lee's army. But eventually, by the end of 1864, this series of battles ended with both Richmond and Petersburg, two of the largest industrial centers in the Confederacy, under siege, virtually impossible to get supplies in or out of. At the same time as Grant was wearing down Confederate willpower and manpower in Virginia, his second-in-command, Sherman, was pushing through the hole opened at Chattanooga and Chickamauga. He went straight south into Georgia and engaged in a series of vicious battles around the city of Atlanta, one of the other largest industrial centers of the South, and captured it in July of 1864. When he did so, he took a very important measure that others had not. He simply burned a huge portion of the city in an attempt to deny the comfort and resources of the city to Confederate troops after he left. Because even if the city was left under occupation, which would be difficult, it would still probably smuggle supplies out to Confederate troops. This approach of total war was very successful, and in fact he applied it again over the course of the next several months as he moved across the state of Georgia, destroying every single area of supply and industry his army could touch with its scouts or its troop columns. He captured Savannah in December and then moved north during the rest of 1864 and the beginning of 1865, devastating the central cotton regions of the South and the entire economy of that area. Between Sherman's march to the sea and the sieges of Richmond and Petersburg, the South was swiftly running low on morale, men, resources, and even tactical alternatives. Then, at the beginning of the fighting season, that is, once snows were off the ground and the ground was less muddy, in 1865, Grant launched his final campaign, pushing the Confederate Army out of both Petersburg and Richmond. In fact, the Confederates torched Richmond as they left, hoping it would end up slowing Grant down. It didn't slow Grant down very much, and he chased the Confederate Army all the way out into the west of Virginia, where they finally met at a place called Appomattox, and General Lee signed a document of surrender. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse officially ended the military side of the war. It's important because really Lee and other Confederate generals could have decided to keep running. They could have decided to fight a large-scale guerrilla war in the mountains of the South, but instead there was a surrender. The fact that that surrender came was a direct result of all of the key battles that we've talked about. The sheer scale of losses, the approach of total war, the repeated frustrations in an attempt to drain the North of will to fight or resources or even bring in foreign intervention, meant that Lee and other Confederate generals saw no other option, ultimately, but to surrender after the Appomattox Campaign. That really brings our discussion of the military side of the war to a close. But believe me, there's a lot more to the Civil War than the series of battles we just talked about.